Hey, so if you're watching this video, that means that you followed the link. You would have watched the introduction that I had made, and now you are on the first video lecture. This is how things are going to go for now. When things change, then we'll adapt to them. We are adapting now. So, yeah, basically how it's going to go is every day I'm going to create one of these videos, and it follows along with our student activity guide booklets. So we are going to do which activity guide are we working on today? We are doing activity 14 in this is the last activity in Unit 2. So for those of you that were present on Friday, this is what we worked on. I'm just reviewing this one just because there was so many people missing. So I have the presentation opened up here on my laptop. I'm literally going to go through the slides, and then if I find any relevant other videos to support what's not in the video already, I will leave them in the description so you can watch them as well. I will, whatever I think is relevant for you to know. You're going to work through your booklets. You're going to fill in the summary section. You can fill in your booklet. But how I want the booklets to go from now on is you're going to do the questions and the summary, the definitions, the combine the sentence, that whole page on a Google Doc, and then it's going to be sent. You'll send it to me, and that's how I'm going to mark these coming booklets. So that's how things are going to be now. So let's just begin. I don't want to waste too much of your time with this dragged on introduction. So we're on Student Activity Guide 14, Historical Perspectives of Early Canada. So the question that you should be trying to fill out in the summary is, what was early Canadian nationalism? So this is page 20 of your booklet. So some of the names of and concepts that you will be introduced to is Louis LaFontaine and Robert Baldwin, responsible government, numbered treaties, the Indian Act of 1876, and Louis Riel. We're going to, hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a good idea of how each of those, either people or treaties or legislation and concepts, they kind of created this early Canadian nationalism. And I'm going to link it to one of the things that we've talked about in the first unit, types of nationalism that we've addressed. So let's begin. So we're going to go to the pre-Confederation Canada. So we're looking at the colony of Canada prior to 1867. 1867 is when Confederation happened. So if you're following along, this is slide 84. We have a map of 1862. This is what Canada looked like. So Canada was divided into upper, which was the English-speaking, and lower, which is the French-speaking Canada. So that's in Eastern Canada, though. In 1841, they were both merged into the province of Canada. So Upper Canada became Canada West, and that's basically Southern Ontario now. Lower Canada, now Southern Quebec, was called Canada East. We do still have Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Newfoundland on the east coast. We have Rupert's Land in the middle, which is administered by the British, the Hudson's Bay Company, but it's mostly a fur trading area. Then we'll have the Northwest Territories, the Stikine Territory, and British Columbia. We have Alaska, which belongs to Russia, and the United States. has been a country since 1776. So that's kind of the lay of the land out there. Um, so only English could be spoken in the Canadian legislature. So the British wanted the French to be assimilated. So um, the government structure of that time was only English. Nowadays, for those of you that want to become a member of parliament or prime minister, you need to learn French because we are a bilingual country. So we have two officially recognized official languages. But in the 1860s, no. It's only English. So they want to assimilate, they want to bring French-speaking Canadians into English-speaking society. So there is a lot of alienation based on culture. So then we were introduced to two really crucial figures in early Canadian history. Louis Lafontaine of Canada East, so he is French. The last name probably should have given it away. Joined forces with Robert Baldwin of Canada West. So English and French are being represented by these two individuals, and they demanded what was called then responsible government, but which could be seen as self-determination. So it's Canada, or the colony of Canada, having more say in its runnings and its existence. So they wanted the governor of Canada to be responsible to the people of Canada and not a British governor. So the colony was run by a governor. He would come from England, establish himself in the colony. He would run it, but he wasn't from there. So a lot of people felt that wasn't the wisest choice. So what they want is responsible government, and it's a government that is established by the colony and with someone from the colonies, kind of making sure that the needs of the colonies are maintained. What we can see next is it relates more to the Fathers of Confederation. So following the American Civil War, which ended in 1865, Canada's future was unclear. There is a fear that this sort of conflict could spread into the north, into Canada. So some Americans believed Canada should be a part of the United States. French Canadians were concerned that their culture was being destroyed. English-speaking Canadians now outnumbered French-speaking Canadians. So there is a fear that because the Americans now are done with their Civil War, they can focus their attention on Canada. And the British, who are excellent at the divide and conquer method, kind of see the problem with the French Canadians as something that the Americans could exploit. They could take advantage of it, persuading them to join the United States, because the French were a minority. Their language was protected by the Quebec Act, but they are being alienated by government, because remember, it's only English. So if you were a French-speaking person of the colonies, you didn't speak English, you were in trouble. So we're going to see how the American Revolution does kind of play an impact on early perspectives of Canadian nationalism. So on slide 87, there is a crash course video of the American Civil War. It's 12 minutes long. I would encourage you to watch it. For those of you that were in class, though, you've already seen it, so there's no need. But back on to the Fathers of Confederation. So economics played a factor as well. Changes in how the British traded with their colonies was causing problems in Canada. So we are seeing this relationship of colony and mother country, we'll say, start to create a divide um, in Canada. So the new leaders, John A. Macdonald and George Etienne Cartier, wanted an independent Canada which promoted French and English culture. So this, we're going to connect it to the first unit where we talked about different types of nationalism. This is kind of the birth of civic nationalism. So what they were wanting is a government, an independent government, so they're talking self-determination for the people of Canada, and they wanted independent, but they're also going to promote and support French and English culture. So it's not ethnic nationalism because they are not the same ethnicity. Not cultural because we're talking French and English here. So it's civic nationalism because it's going to have the same set of laws that are for all members of the colonies, regardless of culture. So this is kind of the birth of Canadian nationalism, the civic nationalism that we kind of talked about with things like the Canadian Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So there is a meeting in Charlotte. I can't even say it. A meeting for Confederation, so joining together. So the four founding provinces of Canada was Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. Confederated in 1867. So Canada was born July 1st, 1867, with those four provinces. British Columbia is a thing, but it's on the other side of Canada, and there's this huge empty space that we haven't really touched yet. So they're kind of out there. Newfoundland has rejected this, so they are not involved, and they won't join Confederation until after the Second World War. So, but we'll get to that later on. So we are born. Canada is born with the four provinces labeled there. But it's not just the French and the British that live in Canada. We have to talk about the Indigenous people. So the Indigenous people of Canada were excluded from the process of Confederation. So they were not invited. They weren't addressed. They were nothing. They were just there, but they weren't. Nobody said, "Hey, this is what's going on. Do you want to join?" No, it was just they were going to be along for the ride. So how to deal with the Indigenous way was an early issue for the founders of Canada, because we focused our attention right now on Eastern Canada. That piece of Canada in the middle, which now we call I guess Western Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, that's up in the air because that territory is home to many different First Nations tribes. So the early founders of Canada had to figure out how best to work with them. The goal was to clear Western Canada for European settlement, though, because Canada had more autonomy, it was more independent. It was still part of the British Empire. It had its own government, its own structure, but it was still a part. So Europeans were still coming in because there was so much land available in Canada that people were encouraged and they were wanting to settle. So they needed to continue to expand, but they were expanding into territory that it was had belonged to the First Nations people. So the numbered treaties were 11 treaties between the Canadian government and the Indigenous peoples between 1871 and 1921. So we're talking almost 100 years. The terms varied, but the Canadian government promised to support the Indigenous if they surrendered land rights. So we are living on one of these numbered treaties. We're on Treaty 7 land in southern Alberta. But if you look at the map here, hopefully you can read it. You can also Google treaty lands in Canada. It just shows the divide and what land was given at what time, at one point in time. And if you were really curious, you can go into specific treaties and see what was signed off on. So they're giving up land rights, but they are told that they will be supported. And the Indian Act of 1876 gave control of the indigenous to the federal government. People classified as Indian could only become citizens of Canada if they gave up their treaty rights. So what they've done here is two things. And this is very crucial to understand. This has never happened inside of Canada to any other group. The Canadian government at this time has established who is and who is not Indigenous. That would be like saying the Canadian government would come to me and decide whether I was Italian or not. So it is huge. They have taken huge control of a person's existence, and what they've done is they've given them a really tough choice. So you could become a Canadian citizen and enjoy the privileges that came with that, but then you gave up your treaty rights. So it was either one or the other, which is extremely difficult. It's kind of like trying to create this sort of nationalism that didn't exist. They're trying to make Canadians out of other people, and it's a force. So it is unfortunate, but this is what the Indian Act did. There is a percentage depending on blood. I studied it at the University of Alberta. There was actually a percentage of how much blood would make you Indigenous. And for women, if you were a First Nations woman and you married a non-Indigenous man, you lost your Indigenous rights, your treaty rights. But if you were an Indigenous male and you married a non-Indigenous female, she actually gained your rights. So it is very interesting. The Indian Act caused a lot of difficulty for Indigenous people, but this is one of the first steps of early Canada and its growth. So again, if you have any questions throughout this video, please make sure you either email me or you write a comment, and I will do my best to answer them. Hopefully, if there's multiple people asking the same question, someone will, you'll all see the same answer. So let's move on though. So obviously, we are going to see some resistance to the Canadian government trying to get more involved and occupy more land that had belonged to the Indigenous people. So Louis Riel, if you aren't aware, was a member of the Métis people. So for those of you that don't know, Métis are people of mixed heritage. So they are Indigenous of whatever tribe, and they also are European as well. So they have parents of both. So Louis Riel is a Métis leader who challenges the authority of the Canadian government. So there was resistance to the Canadian expansion in the West. The first resistance is in the Red River Colony, which is modern-day Manitoba, in 1869 till 1870. So what happens is they're trying to expand west, but the Métis occupy that area, the Red River, which is in southern, it's near Winnipeg today. So the Métis felt their way of life, culture, and belief was threatened. So they had occupied that land, and now the Canadian government is pushing ever closer, asking, well, more like telling them to move to expand so that they can expand farther. They're fearful that their rights will be taken away, their culture will be taken away. They'll be assimilated into Canadian society forcefully. So the Métis, led by Louis Riel, resist. They take control of one of the forts, and they occupy it. So a Canadian expedition is sent to restore federal authority, but the province of Manitoba is created. So it all sparks when one of the hostages at the camp is executed. So Louis Riel is seen as a criminal, but is also one of the founding fathers, if not the founding father, of the modern province of Manitoba. He petitioned the Canadian government to establish it. So if you look at early maps of Canada at this time, in the 1860s, Manitoba is essentially a square that's attached to Ontario. It was called the postage stamp province because it was so small and it was a square. Louis Riel escapes and goes into exile. So he'll go to the United States. He actually becomes a teacher in Montana, and he'll stay there for a little bit until he makes his return to Saskatchewan and Alberta, where he will lead another rebellion. So we're seeing a challenge to this early Canadian nationalism. On the one hand, we see the civic nationalism being created between the English and the French, but it excludes entirely the Indigenous and the Métis of Canada. And then we see the resistance with things like Louis Riel at the Red River, and then later on in the Northwest Rebellion when the Europeans make their way to modern-day Saskatchewan, Alberta. So there is conflict and there is resistance being created. So, like I said, as the Europeans and Canadian government expand further west, they've taken modern-day Manitoba, and they've started to settle it with Europeans, but they again are not satisfied. So again, they're continually pushing farther and farther west. And again, they meet resistance from the Métis and Indigenous people who at one time occupied places like in Ontario and Manitoba, but were forced to move farther and farther west. They meet resistance there because they've been kind of pushed all across Canada. And Louis Riel, again, he returns to lead this rebellion because people have communicated to him while he was in Montana that this was happening. So he sees the call, he takes the call, and he returns. So 2,000 Métis violently opposed the federal government, who sent an expedition of 5,000 militia to restore authority. So we're seeing a physical pitched battle. So if you're following along on slide 91, you can actually see a painting of this battle. The decisive battle of Batoche, I'm probably saying this wrong, seals the fate of the West. The future of Canada will be dictated by the federal government. So at this battle, the Métis and Indigenous tribes are defeated. Louis Riel is arrested, so he doesn't actually get to escape, and he's put on trial, and he will be executed by the Canadian government for treason. So he is a figure in Canadian history that has two opposing sides going at it. One side sees him as a traitor, the other side sees him as a hero. Those who see him as a traitor tend to be the European Canadians or European descent, whereas if you're a Métis, I don't know if you're an Indigenous Canadian, you'd see him as a hero, preventing the expansion of the Canadian government or into Indigenous land. So on slide 92, there's a 10-minute video of Louis Riel and the resistance. So I really encourage that you to watch that. Like I said, Louis Riel is a very interesting character when we talk about Canadian history, because you either love him or you hate him, I guess you can say, to be cliche. So there's also, after that, you can watch the Crash Course, The American Civil War Part 2. It's an 11-minute video that will give you a good understanding of the American Civil War and its impact on Canada as well, because the United States is our neighbor, and whatever affects them affects us. For example, one of the reasons that we expanded west so quickly is because of that huge gap and that huge border between the United States and Canada. There was fear by Sir John A. Macdonald, our then the first Prime Minister and the then Prime Minister, that the Americans would come up and take modern day Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and cut off British Columbia from the rest of Canada. So we did move across, and we do see the Canadian Pacific Railway being built as well to prevent American incursions or entering into modern day Canada across that border. So after the end of the Civil War, there is that fear, because now they're not fighting each other. They can focus on expanding as well. So, to summarize what was early Canadian nationalism, things that you can make sure you have written down. You can talk about the structure of Canada pre-Confederation, so the division between the English and the French. We can talk about Louis LaFontaine and Robert Baldwin and their joint call for responsible government. So we're seeing early self-determination in its smallest form. We can see with Confederation the call for by Sir John A. Macdonald and George Cartier, the want for an independent government and the inclusion of French and English culture. So a civic nationalism, you could say, is being born here as well. Then I would also make sure that, to summarize, talk about or have something related to the number treaties and the relationship between the European Canadians and the Indigenous people, because early Canadian nationalism doesn't really involve the Indigenous people unless they're willing to sign treaties, which does show you the way that they respond. I would, and make sure that you also are aware and mention things like the resistance to this developing your Canadian nationalism, because it didn't include the perspective of Indigenous people. So we see people like Louis Riel rising up and resisting this assimilation by the Canadian government in two places, in the Red River Rebellion and the Northwest Rebellion. So that is the end of this. Each day I will be posting a video that goes along with the booklets. If you don't have the next booklet, they're all on our D12. You just go to resources, content, and it'll say student activity guides. They're all there. If you want to print it out at home, feel free to. If you want to just follow it online, again, feel free to do that as well. Please make sure, I know I said this at the beginning, if you have not already watched the introduction video, please do. It has a lot of information about things like the written responses and the unit tests, because I know technically we were scheduled to have one tomorrow, but we're not going to do that, obviously. So make sure you watch that and you just keep up to date with that, with keeping up to date with watching out for things on our D12 Brightspace or from the school. Okay? So I'll see you tomorrow. Well, I won't actually see you. You'll see me, but I won't see you. See ya.